Hello, everyone. This is Isaac Ruderman. I'm talking to you from my home in Brooklyn, New York. Today is the 3rd of November, 2021. It's with a heavy heart that I make this video and try to encapsulate the life of somebody very special who passed away just 2 days ago, Mr. Elliot Wolf of Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, Mr. Elliot Wolf was 85 years old, which means he was born in around 1936. He was a twin. His twin brother is Jeffrey Wolf. And everything I'm going to say really is by implication also applicable to his brother Jeffrey Wolf. It's just that Elliot Wolf was the more dominant twin. They were identical twins. And in a certain sense, Jeffrey, while having the same talents and skills and other opportunities, and even sharing the limelight at many times with Elliot, did live in his brother's shadow. And I'm sure he didn't mind because he was very respectful, and both brothers lived with the highest regard for each other. In fact, when Mr. Wolf passed away, when Elliot passed away, he was together with Jeffrey and the family in the Kruger National Park when he took ill. So the family was together at the time when Mr. Elliot Wolf passed away. Before I get into the subject of Mr. Elliot Wolf, I'd like to spend a little time talking about the history of the Jews of South Africa and put things in context which will help you appreciate what I'm saying about Mr. Wolf and his contribution to South African Jewry. Between 1880 and the 1920s, the majority of the Jews in South Africa immigrated there, or their ancestors, their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents immigrated there, mostly from Lithuania, also Latvia, Estonia, parts of Russia, a handful from Poland and other places. Before that, there were Jewish immigrants from Germany, but the main waves came in the 1880s through the 1920s, even a few in the 1930s, till immigration was shut off actually all over the world. And eventually, the 30 or 40 or 50,000 Jews who emigrated there blossomed and grew into a community of at least 120,000 Jews, maybe even as many as 140,000, but definitely it became a community of about 120,000 Jewish people till around the 1970s, when, due to the changes in the political situation, many Jews started to emigrate. And today, in 2021, as I'm talking now on this video, half of South Africa's Jews have left, and there are approximately 60,000 Jews left in South Africa, plus minus. Now, when these Jews came to South Africa between the 1880s and the 1920s, they didn't set up yeshivas and schools of their own as they had them in Europe. What they did was they set up shuls. Every little community they moved to, they built a shul, they built a cemetery, they built they had a Chevra Kadisha to take care of the needs of the people who had passed away. They hired tutors to teach their children, and they set up small chadarim, what's called cheders or Talmud Torahs, which were afternoon schools. But the main education was done in government schools. Wherever the Jews settled, essentially, they sent their children to get an education in government schools. This was already a pattern that had started taking shape in Europe in many places. The Jews would send their children to government schools, government-run schools, and then the children would receive education after hours Chadarim or Talmud Torahs. In Europe, it worked well to some degree, especially in Eastern Europe. But in South Africa, it raised complications, as we'll see. And in the United States, not just in South Africa. This was also a trend that happened in America, that the main schooling was given over to government education, government schools, with a small minority going to private schools. A lot of the private schools were run by the Catholics. So there were Catholic schools, but there were some other elite schools, and they were not too friendly to Jewish people. But the government schools took in everyone. In some places in South Africa, the government schools were Afrikaans speaking. So in the outlying platteland, in the smaller community areas, the smaller towns, there were actually Afrikaans speaking Jews that went to the schools because the schools taught Afrikaans. And in the biggest cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town and Durban and Pretoria, there was a little bit more of an English influence, so they picked up English, and the English culture became the dominant culture. And this continued to 1948. Now, the Wolf brothers, like many people born in the 1930s and 40s and even 50s, and raised in Johannesburg, did not have the privilege of having a full-time Jewish education. I know that Mr. Elliot Wolf told me that he went to Cheder. They did study Hebrew, and I think he may have even gotten a distinction in Hebrew. I'm not sure about that, but I know he surprised me once by writing to me a few words in Hebrew with a beautiful Hebrew writing script. So this wasn't well known about him, but he did have his own Jewish education in the Cheder, the Cheders of Yeovil, where they grew up. Yeovil is a suburb of Johannesburg. Now, in 1948, as South African Jews know, the State of Israel was founded. And also during that year, the King David Schools were founded, a group of laymen and activists hired, I think the first principal was a Mr. Lipschitz, and they started the King David Primary School with a handful of pupils, handful of students. And it was a co-ed school open to boys and girls. I believe the first student, one of the first students was Mrs. Batya Kurtztag. She was the daughter of Rabbi Alloy. Rabbi Alloy, believing in Jewish education, sent his oldest daughter to be enrolled in the King David School, and she's actually one of the first people who was recruited to the new high school in 1954. And in 1954-55, they hired Mr. Norman Sandler. There were laymen, there were people like Mr. Meshaka, who was the director of the Board of Education, and there was Rabbi Isaac Goss, who was hired as the director. Originally, he wasn't a rabbi. He was an educator, a lecturer at Dormfontein and Randfontein, also a thriving community, but it never had a continuity. So they hired Mr. Norman Sandler, and he brought his own education and skills. He was originally from Natal. He was educated in the school system of Natal, and he was a schoolmaster of the old school, very much a disciplinarian, and a scholar of English and Latin. And he built the base and set the standard of the King David schools from 1954 till the time he retired in 1973, I believe it was. He built the basis for the King David schools. He set the standard of excellence and the type of school that it would be. Co-ed for, and also founding of the schools, Victory Park. Eventually, one of his deputies, Mr. Eddie Tannenbaum, became the principal of King David Victory Park. Eventually, the schools would go over and be handed to the two Wolf brothers. Mr. Elliot Wolf would become the principal, the headmaster of King David School, Linksfield. That was around 1974. And his brother became the principal of King David at Victory Park maybe a year later or around the same time. And they built on the excellence of Mr. Norman Sandler. Mr. Norman Sandler also, by the way, pioneered the Ulpan scheme, where students in Form 3, that is grade 10, today I think it's called grade 10, would go to Israel for 4 months, 3.5, 4 months, and tour Israel and spend time studying Hebrew and spending time with Israeli families and Israeli people and educators to give them that feel for Israel and encourage the growth of Zionism. But it was Mr. Sandler who hired the Wolf brothers in 1967, and in 1968, they came to King David School. Now, they were the product, as I said, of secular education. They did not go to Jewish schools because there were no Jewish schools. But they did go to the Cheders, and they excelled in Hebrew and their love of Zionism. In 1968, I was about 15 years old. I was in Form 2, and I had only been in South Africa for 8 years because my parents had moved, had made Yerida, emigrated from Israel to South Africa in 1960. So by 1968, I had been in South Africa barely 7 or 8 years. So I was still finding my oats culturally, and I was more of a wild Israeli than a cool, calm, and collected South African boy. And my knowledge of English was still raw. And in 1968, I had Mr. Wolf as an English teacher. And one of the memories that I have of him of that year is that he taught us Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And I was amazed at how much this prim and proper English gentleman, which Mr. Wolf was, in my eyes and in our eyes, loved Huck Finn, and how much he used to smile and giggle and laugh under his breath a lot of the time, being amused by the nuances and the things that he read in Huckleberry Finn. Now, little did I know at that point that eventually one day I would also major in English. It was one of my majors, English, and as well as history. History was my main major, and then I had 2 majors, history and English. And Mr. Wolf nurtured those first. He was one of those who nurtured those first interests that I had in the subtlety and complexity and beauty of the English language. In 1969, when I was in Form 3, Mr. Wolf was the co-leader of our Ulpan group to Israel. We went to Sde Boker. There was a group that went to Jerusalem. We went to Sde Boker in the Negev, near Kibbutz Sde Boker. We were in Midreshet Sde Boker, which was built up by David Ben-Gurion, the retired Prime Minister of Israel. He was still alive at that time. And Mr. Elliot Wolf, together with Mr. Michael Katsu, were the co-leaders. In 1971, Mr. Wolf was my matric English teacher. And it's interesting, we weren't the top class. There were top classes with, in those days, they were streamed. So there was the A classes, the B classes, the C classes, the D classes, the E. And I certainly wasn't in the A or the B class at that time. I don't know if I ever will get there. I'm still trying. And Mr. Wolf did not push us. He seemed to know the limits of every student. He knew how far he could go with students. I remember him talking to me and trying to understand, what my issues were, and I wasn't working my potential. And he would patiently stand there listening to me and chit-chatting with me, as he did with hundreds and eventually thousands of students And then he eventually kept that up later in life. He marked one of my essays, and that was I'd written something about how life is tough, and in politics, leaders are cruel, something along those lines. And then he wrote to me, he wrote a comment to me that said, well, don't you have any belief in altruism? And I didn't know what that word meant. I went to look it up. And if you know what altruism means, I think that it's a good summary for Elliot Wolf himself and Jeffrey Wolf, the Wolf brothers and their family. They stand for altruism, caring for others, going for the sake of good, not for any but for goodness. So he introduced me to the word that's called altruism, something that invariably I've come to live most of my life by. It's not about me. I want to focus on Mr. Elliot Wolf's accomplishments. He became the headmaster in 1974. And interestingly, I had joined a student program called JSUP, Jewish Students University Program, a new program that had started for Jewish university students to do degrees through UNISA with a full-time program of half-day Jewish studies, continuing the day school concept to the next level of university students. And I graduated from that program. I got my BA, and I had to do I decided to go into teaching. I had to do a practicum, 6 months of teaching at a school because I was majoring in history and English teaching. But at that time, in 1976, the King David schools, for the first time in their history, introduced Jewish studies as a separate subject, not just Hebrew. Hebrew had existed, of course, as a subject with its ancillaries, Hebrew literature, Torah, and various things like that. Books and booklets based on Hebrew literature and based on the Torah subjects, but not going into detail of Judaism as such, as a religion and its history. And for the first time, King David decided to introduce Jewish studies. Perhaps it was in response to the growth of other Jewish educational yeshivas and Beit Yaakovs in Johannesburg. So they felt the need to introduce more Jewish content, and it was done. Eventually, it became a matric subject. But I taught 8 Form 4s, Jewish studies. Instead of teaching history and English, the UNISA agreed that I could teach it made no difference what I taught, as long as I taught something. I had practical experience in teaching, and Mr. Wolf and Mr. Sandler were my supervisors. Mr. Wolf was my principal, actually my boss, and he was not an interfearsome boss. He was a very caring boss and very encouraging to me. But if there was any dispute between me and the students, he would invariably take the side of the students. That's the way he was. He cared very much for his student body and took them into account first, and then what the teacher had to say. And he became a very compassionate and compelling educator and beloved teacher as a result of that. I was supposed to continue teaching at King David School, but in 1977, I went to the United States and decided to study in yeshiva, and that started another chapter in my life. But whenever I would visit South Africa, I would come and visit King David and visit Mr. Wolf. I would visit Mr. Sandler. Eventually, Mr. Sandler moved to Australia. But whenever I visited South Africa to visit my mother and other relatives, or I was there for a family simcha, I would go to King David and visit Mr. Wolf and the school. Now, something happened on one of my visits in 1994. I went to visit the school, and the JSUP, the program that Rabbi Kutztag was heading, had grown into a program with over 100 students, and they were in need of extra funding. They weren't meeting their budget. So I went to talk to Mr. Samuel Berman, who was the director of the South African Board of Jewish Education at that time. And he told me that he was actually planning on founding a new organization called the King David Schools Foundation. That was in 1994. The foundation was founded the next year, I think, 1995. And what we decided to do was to launch it with an alumni event in America, that we would try to gather King David alumni, or Old Davidians as they were called, in America, North America, in the United States and Canada. And eventually we would have this reunion in California, near Los Angeles. And we brought out Mr. Elliot Wolf and Mr. Norman Sandler, and Samuel Berman came along. Now, Mr. Samuel Berman did found the King David Schools Foundation, but in the beginning, it was very difficult to raise funds, whether it was the fact that Mr. Berman was not from the King David Schools family. He originally was from Natal, I believe, or the community, the community of King David alumni wasn't yet ready to become philanthropic. But it was very difficult, and very few responded to the appeals. Also, there was no internet then. You're talking about 1994, 1995, when we had the reunion. This is before the internet really took off. Maybe some people had it privately, but it was not a huge, well-known phenomenon. Most people did not have an internet connection yet. So it was very difficult to reach people. You had to do it by post, and post from South Africa, mailing letters from South Africa to America and to Canada was very expensive. And then there's a question of how to gather the funds, because the people in America wanted a tax deduction. So I went ahead and founded a nonprofit organization called AFSAGE, American Friends of South African Jewish Education, in 1995, which existed. It helped for 20 years. I worked together with Mr. Samuel Berman, and then later Mr. Elliot Wolf took over Samuel Berman's job at the King David Schools Foundation when he retired as principal, and he was appointed the director of the King David Schools Foundation in 2002. The moment Mr. Elliot Wolf was appointed as the director of the King David Schools Foundation in Johannesburg, I contacted him immediately and brought him up to date, because there was a little bit of an interregnum. The King David Schools and South African Board of Jewish Education had gone through a rough patch, and Mr. Zulberg had taken over the running of the school in a for-profit manner, and they neglected the alumni. Incidentally, the concept of contacting alumni and building an alumni organization was started by Mr. Norman Sandler. I remember him having meetings and saying it was time to form an Old Davidians Association for people who had graduated, to bring them together in a kind of old boys club, old boys, old girls club. And but he was way ahead of his time before anyone really did anything about it. I mean, he was talking about it in the 1970s, but it would go at least another 20 years before they had the King David Schools Foundation. And then from the 1990s, it would take another 15 to 20 years till real fundraising could get going, where they would get a benefit from the alumni base who would become generous and start giving in a significant way back to the King David Schools to help the schools and needy students and causes, and help the schools function and expand. At this point, before I get more into the King David Schools Foundation and Elliot Wolf's role in it, I'd like to just touch on this point of Mr. Wolf's loyalty. One of his great trademarks is loyalty. He was loyal to his parents. That's known. He lived with his parents, his mother eventually. When his father passed away, he lived with his mother till her dying days. He was loyal to his family. It was very private, but very loyal. He was loyal to his brother Jeffrey and his family, to his nephews and great nephews and nieces. He was loyal to his students to a fault. He was loyal to his colleagues. His relationship, for example, with Mrs. June Barclay was unparalleled in closeness. She became his deputy principal, deputy headmaster, headmistress at King David, and they were incredibly loyal to each other and helped each other in all ways. And he was loyal to his boss, Mr. Sandler, who had hired him. He was eternally indebted and in gratitude to Mr. Sandler for having hired him and shown him the way, brought him into the King David schools and paved the way for him, paved actually a golden path. It was Mr. Norman Sandler who paved a golden path for Mr. Elliot Wolf and Jeffrey Wolf to enter into their prestigious roles at the King David schools institutions. Interestingly, only after he got sick, when news came out so suddenly that he was hospitalized and he was gravely ill in a coma, that his Hebrew name became known, Elisha ben Chaya. His Hebrew name was Elisha. And it's interesting that the biblical Elisha was a prophet who was a disciple of Elijah, Eliyahu. Elisha and Eliyahu were very close. Elisha was the loyal disciple of Eliyahu and was basically an example for a prototype for his namesake down the line. That was Mr. Wolf's, that was Elliot Wolf's trademark, loyalty. So that's a distinction and a distinctive feature of the original Elisha, who was the disciple of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. By the way, he also had basically a near photographic memory. He never forgot a person. He never forgot a face. He never forgot an incident. He was just an incredibly astute person. He was really from a different era, you could say. His people from his cohort, of his age group, became incredible lawyers, doctors, accountants, professionals, and they bucked the tide, the Wolf brothers, and instead became teachers. But you could even generals, you could see him in his cool, calm, collected way running a battlefield, or running a legal practice, or running a medical practice, or running an accountancy practice, or being a head of a faculty in a university, a head of Latin department, or a head of a corporation, because he was incredibly astute and he had fantastic skills and strengths. He knew English and Latin cold. Sometimes I had the suspicion that he even thought in Latin, because he was like so familiar with Latin and the whole Latin culture and the history of Rome and the Romans. And he really had this uncanny connection with Rome, Latin, and of course with the English language. And also not just colleagues and friends, but also neighbors. Anyone he came into contact with, he was incredible. Politically, in his views, he didn't make them known really, but from his actions, you can see he was very progressive. He really believed in the new South Africa. He was very liberal. I remember that he once brought cuttings when we had an English class in matric. I'm talking about Elliot Wolf, and he showed us the report of South African Nazis, mostly from the Afrikaner community, who were marching down to the Bay to stop immigration of Jews into South Africa. So he was very anti-Nazi, which most Jews are, of course, all Jews are. And he was very progressive. And he lived that into South Africa with the new South Africa when there was a change of government to black majority rule. And as part of his fundraising and money that he raised, he was very adamant, and he took an active part in this, that there should be outreach to the African communities, to the black communities, black schools, disadvantaged schools should also receive some of the aid. And there are those alumni who support that and connected well with Elliott's message and went on to support the New South Africa in a material way. So he was definitely very progressive in that attitude. His attitude to Judaism is more complex, and you can see me being a religious person. Originally, when I was in school, I was not that religious, but I became religious after leaving school, and I came to teach Jewish studies, religious studies in school. So I got to interact with Elliott in a different way, where most people don't really interact with him, both as a former student. He was my teacher. He was one of my Ulpan guides. And then he became my boss, a colleague, and me being religious in his school, a religious Jewish studies teacher, so I was able to intersect with him on a different plane. What I noticed, I remember at one of a few of the assemblies that I came to when I was teaching Jewish studies in 1976, is that he did come to morning prayers and he diligently put on his tefillin. Every morning he would come to prayers and put on his tefillin, which is more than I can say for other male Jewish members of staff, but he definitely fulfilled his role in that capacity. So he did what he could do. He was respectful. He was very curious. I know years later when I was back in the States and I went through a time when I was writing weekly essays on the weekly Torah portion, I would send them to him as well. He was on my emailing list and he read them and he would give me feedback, telling me how interested it was and how much he learned from them. So he was very positive about that. So what he kept, he kept. And what he didn't keep, he didn't keep. So he practiced Judaism lovingly as far as he was able. And by extension, he knew the boundaries of how far you could push South African Jews and Jewry in this department, because it's a tricky subject. Whilst during the last 50 years, there's been a move towards more religion, and there are now more religious from Jewish day schools in Johannesburg in South Africa. In fact, it's an even split. My estimate is that there are about over 3,000 Jewish children in King David, and there are over 3,000 Jewish children in Yeshiva College, Torah Academy, these other schools. Elliott was aware of those schools, but he felt that within King David, he knew the bounds and the limits, the capacities of what those students who wanted Judaism but didn't want it too intensely and didn't want King David to become a yeshiva. It was not a yeshiva, it was not a Beit Yaakov, as he told me a few times. And I agreed with him. It's not a yeshiva, it's not a Beit Yaakov. And the question is how much more Judaism you can inculcate and introduce to the students. Incidentally, today I was watching a video recently of a graduation ceremony for the latest how much more verses there was, and genuinely there is much more. There's a rabbi on campus. Already every King David school has a campus rabbi. Anton School, the Victory School, and the Linksfield School have campus rabbis and Jewish studies programs. He respected when students would become more religious, like in my case, and in the cases of many others. But basically, once we became frum, it wasn't his department. You could sense that we sort of dropped off his radar. Not me. I personally kept up a close connection with him till the very end. But others sort of dropped off his radar because they were now in a different league. And he was concerned with those who were within the King David Schools framework. He was the self-appointed guardian of secular traditional Zionist South African Jewish pupils and students at King David and of South African Jewry. I mean, basically, King David School is the core of the Jewish community. It's the functional, strong core around which everything else has grown. Yeshiva College came after King David. All these other schools came after King David. So King David was the first and has remained the core institution of this whole Jewish educational network within Johannesburg and South Africa. In his way, he was a living example of that statement that we read in our Shabbat prayers of Kol she'oskim b'tzorchei tzibur b'chinam HaKadosh Baruch Hu yishalem scharam. Of all those who labor with the needs of the community for nothing, God will repay their reward. And I'll mention that later. So let me go back now a little bit. In 1994, I visited King David High School. At that time, I was practicing as a rabbi of Jewish outreach in New York. I was living in Brooklyn. And as I said, we were planning a reunion to help the King David Schools Foundation start its outreach to alumni, first in North America, because that's where the wealthiest student base, America is the wealthiest country, and many of the wealthiest alumni live in the United States. So in 1995, we had our first reunion near Los Angeles. And then we had two more reunions in 1997 and 1995, 1997 and 1999. And we brought Elliot Wolf to all of those. We brought Jeffrey Wolf to at least one of them, the last one, which was also near California, near Los Angeles. And in 1997 to Toronto, we brought Elliot and Mr. Wolf, Mr. Sandler, for both 95, 97, and 99. So in 2002, he becomes the director of the King David Schools Foundation. And in America, I set up the AFSAGE, American Friends of South African Jewish Education, which helped the King David Schools raise money, channel money that people in the United States could get a tax-deductible donation, tax-deductible receipt for their donations. And this is where another aspect of Mr. Wolf's career comes to light, because it hasn't been stressed enough. I mean, it's mentioned here and there, but it needs to be brought out forcefully that Mr. Wolf was a fantastic and incredible fundraiser, and I saw it and experienced it with my own eyes and within my own life. And I became a colleague of his in that department. All donations in the United States that were made to the King David Schools Foundation came through AFSAGE for 15 years, from 1995 through 2005. So, 2015, 1995 to 2015. And so from 2002 till 2015, that's for 13 years. 13 years, I worked with Mr. Wolf, sending him donations of $5,000, $10,000, $25,000. I didn't raise the money. Mr. Wolf raised the money. He did it by speaking to people, speaking to the alumni, sending them emails. By that time, the internet had developed. He was able to email. And he managed to cajole and to convince and to connect in a nice way. I don't know how he did it, but he started this roll of money, which eventually will turn into a flood of money, relatively speaking. Once Raylene Trudonsky became the associate director, now she's the executive director of the King David Schools Foundation. It was 10 years ago about. But for 13 years, we worked so well together that he even called me, I know at one point, my guardian angel. He called me his guardian angel because I was able to provide tax-deductible receipts to the donors in the United States, because AFSAGE was a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation that I'd incorporated myself. Mr. Wolf said, whatever expenses I incurred, I should deduct. I did not charge anything. I did this as a labor of love. I did it freely, pro bono, but I did have legal expenses to pay off the lawyers who incorporated, and I did have other expenses, mailing expenses, banking expenses, accounting expenses, whatever it was. He would say to me, take off whatever expenses you feel unnecessary. And he used all his brilliant skills that he had as an educator to raise money for King David. Now, that's also a form of education, because you have to educate people. You have to draw them, educare, to draw close, to lead on, to make people aware that they need to contribute to their alma mater, to their community. Now, in the olden days, it used to be that the Jews of South Africa would send money to the communities in Lithuania that were impoverished, because Lithuania was one of the poorest parts of Europe, and the Jews of South Africa would send donations, tzedakah, or there would be collectors that would come from Israel. There are still collectors that come from Israel to support orphans or orphanages or schools or poor communities or people in need or people in crisis. But now that the community of South Africa has shrunk to half its size, and more basically South African Jews live outside of South Africa than in South Africa, it took a very special person, it took a brilliant person to be able to tap into the largesse and the success and the good-heartedness of alumni and expatriates and people living far away whose own children were secularized. In many cases, by the way, a lot of these alumni, I won't say a lot, some of these alumni had already intermarried. They drifted away. They didn't have the strengths and the structures of the Jewish community in South Africa, and they didn't practice Judaism strongly enough. So unfortunately, they married out of the faith, something that was always considered a tragedy in the South African community. Nevertheless, Mr. Wolf was able to keep a connection with these people, all kinds of people, and have them contribute still to the King David schools, because everybody appreciated what King David had done for them. And it's not just King David, it's a nostalgia for South Africa. It's a nostalgia for that unique community. In a certain sense, the King David schools, the Jewish schools of South Africa, reflected the Jewish community of South Africa. It created its own type of orthodoxy, not quite reform, not quite the conservatives of America, very loyal to orthodoxy, very loyal to tradition, but not following the halacha, not really knowing, being knowledgeable about what Jewish law demands, let's say, for example, about Shabbat. Mr. Wolf did not know all the details of the halacha. Mr. Wolf tried to keep as much as he could, but without a formal education in Jewish law, there's no way you can keep Judaism properly. So for a lot of people, that just wasn't and isn't there. Yet nevertheless, they have this tremendous connection to Judaism, to the Jewish people, to Israel, to Zionism. And Mr. Wolf, Elliot Wolf, was able to tap into that and start the flow of money now back into South Africa, because the community does not have the wherewithal to support its own needs. Because, for example, now with black majority rule, the majority of all Jewish children, in fact, almost all Jewish children are in Jewish schools. I would say more than 90%, with the rest going to other private schools. And so it's and the expenses of tuition are horrendous and humongous. I mean, astronomical figures for salaries and maintenance and staff and security staff. Today you need security staff and busing and computer technology and so on and so forth, special education, and then you got students who cannot pay, then you got single parent homes. It's complicated. But thank God, almost all Jewish students, about 6,000 of them, well, you work out the figures. How many children are there of a community of between 50 to 60,000? Let's say it's 5,000 to 6,000 children, maybe 7,000, 8,000 children. Half are in the King David school system, and the other half are in the religious school systems. So my point is, we need to give Mr. Elliot Wolf credit and all that he is due to him for his abilities as a fundraiser, using his absolutely brilliant coaxing and kibitzing and communication skills to get money flowing into South Africa in the millions of rands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know that in my time, the 20 years that I was running AFSAGE and helping the King David Schools Channel funds, approximately $1 million came just from the United States during those 20 years. Now, with the appointment of Mrs. Raylene Tredonsky about 10 years ago, things became supercharged, and she now, with Elliot, continuing with Elliot Wolf, working on the alumni base, expanded the staff, and now they are raising hundreds of millions of rands, tens of millions of dollars from all over the world, the United Kingdom, Australia, of course, within South Africa, and a lot from the United States and Canada. And a lot of this we know is due to the rise of the internet, and Mr. Wolf became a very skillful user of the internet. His emails, his English writing skills came to the fore. And of course, on Facebook, he would stay in touch. He has a list of like about 2,500 friends, which is a big number on Facebook. Facebook doesn't allow you more than 5,000 friends. Very few people have more than a few hundred friends. He has 2,500, which is a lot. And that's mostly alumni staying in touch with him. And whenever he came to New York with Raylene, they came on visits, we would get together at the reunions, for example, that we had in 1995. I remember how he danced with a passion when we had Jewish songs. He danced the horror with a passion. He was a very strong person. He was an excellent tennis player and tennis coach in his time. And together with Raylene, they've taken the King David Schools Foundation to the next level, and made it into a tremendous success. It's become a bastion of the King David Schools and of the Jewish community, because by extension, everybody benefits when King David benefits. And they've all taken a lead. I believe Yeshiva College has its own fundraising arm, and the other schools, the Lubavitch, do their own fundraising. So everybody is seeing how it successfully it can be done, and they are reaching out and doing it. And this is all due to the pioneering work that the King David Schools Foundation started in 1995. Now, Elliot Wolf was, if you know him, was an intensely private man. You know, no matter how much interaction you would have with him in public, in his professional life, you didn't know anything really about his private life. You didn't know about his relationships with you knew he had an identical twin brother, but you didn't know much about, in fact, you knew nothing of the relationships between him and his brother and his brother's wife, Barbara, and their children and grandchildren, parents, other family members, and almost nothing. But as I mentioned earlier, he was very loyal, for example, and the loyalty bred closeness. One example I can think of, a strong example, is his loyalty and relationship and professional relationship with Mrs. June Barclay, who was his deputy principal at King David when he was the headmaster there, and eventually she retired and moved on to New Zealand. How close they were and how loyal he was to her and she was to him. Finally, when he passed away, he was with his close family, and they were visiting the Kruger National Park when he suddenly got ill, and he passed away peacefully at the age of 85 in Nelspruit. I suppose that's a little town near the Kruger National Park. He loved the Kruger National Park, and it's interesting, he craved privacy, and he would get it at the Kruger National Park. He could do Shabbat his own way in the Kruger National Park, where he did it in his own way, in communion with nature and his beloved South Africa, and away from the prying eyes of people and the public eye, because he was a very private person in a very public position all the time. So I would say, to sum up, that he left a better King David High School for sure. I'm sure where he worked before Parktown Boys High, he left them better off than from the time he came there. One of those rules, the first rule of everything is do no harm, don't do any damage. And I must say that he was an expert at this. Wherever he entered, he did no harm. And on the contrary, he only left things a lot better. He left a better King David High School. He left a better King David Schools Foundation. He left a better Jewish community in Johannesburg, South Africa. He left a better South Africa. He left a better world community, because by the time of his death now, alumni, his students, are spread out all over the world in incredibly important positions, and some of them incredibly wealthy people, very powerful, very influential people in all sectors of life. And you could say even in Torah life, for example, me, even though we had our differences, we had our strong differences on certain points, our disagreements, but we maintained a civil respect for each other, and it was never personal. I never had anything really personal with Mr. Wolf, and he never had any real bones to pick with me. He just maybe didn't like the way I sometimes did things, and for that I apologize. I give a public apology if in any way I upset him, and I hope that in Shamayim, in heaven, he forgives us and any of our wrongdoings. If any of us had ever wronged him, that he be forgiving of us. And in that merit, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu, may God be forgiving of him and his faults, because no human is perfect. Every human has faults. Every Jew has faults. So just as we pray that he forgive us, that Elliot forgive us, may Hashem forgive him. And so may his memory be for a blessing, and may his accomplishments continue for the King David High School, for the King David Schools Foundation, for Johannesburg Jury, South African Jury, for World Jury. And finally, I want to read that prayer that I had mentioned earlier, because I think this prayer is suitable for Elliot and for people like him. Misha Beirach Avatenu Abraham, Yitzchak v'Yaakov. He who blessed our forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hu yivarech et kol hakahal hakodosh hazeh. He should bless this entire holy congregation. All of us, everybody who labored in the same fields of work and endeavor as Mr. Elliot Wolf, Im Kol Kehilot HaKodesh, together with all other holy communities. Haim, they, uneshehem, uvnehem, uvnotehem, they, their wives, their sons, their daughters, v'chol asher lahem, and all that is theirs. Umisha meyachadim batek nisyot letviyah, and those who come to synagogues, to Bate Knesset for tefillah. And by the way, I remember Mr. Wolf accompanying me. Yes, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a trouble of a connection. That we met at the Beit Midrash. There's a Beit Midrash program at the King David School, something we didn't have. There's actually a little section dedicated to morning prayers. And that was also part of his legacy. Whoever comes to pray in the synagogues, and whoever gives light for the candle, in other words, whoever pays the electricity bill, the yain lekiddush havdalah, and whoever pays bread for the poor, helping needy students is giving bread to the poor, whilst it's the same thing. You're providing sustenance by helping the education of Jewish children whose parents are struggling for a piece of bread. Charity for the poor. That's exactly what he helped to provide, charity for the poor. He may not have been the most religious of people, but he certainly practiced this. Tzedakah la'aniyim, he gave tzedakah la'aniyim. V'chol mi she'oskim b'tzachei tzibur be'emunah. And all those who are busy with helping the needs of the community in good faith. Of course, Mr. Wolf received a salary, but it was minimal. He didn't live like a rich man. He didn't get a rich man's salary. He didn't get an executive salary. He started out as a teacher, then as a principal, then as a director. As a retirement job, he became a fundraiser. But the money was not his. And certainly his success lay with the fact not that he worked for a salary, but that he did it with loving kindness for altruistic reasons, but for chesed reasons, for loving kindness reasons. So now, all those, so God who blesses Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let him bless all those who do these things. So then HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yeshalem Scharam. May God, may the Holy One, blessed be He, pay their salary, meaning give them their eternal reward. The Yasir Mehem Kol Machala, and may He remove from them every illness. Mr. Wolf, someone mentioned to me, had stomach troubles for a big part of his life. It's something that wasn't well known. He suffered from health problems. So for 85 years, he was blessed. God removed illness from him till the very end. And may He cure all their bodies. And may He forgive all their sins. And may Hashem, may God send bracha v'hatzlacha, blessing and success, b'chol ma'aseh yedehem, to all the deeds of their hands, to all the actions, everything that Mr. Elliot Wolf built, and his predecessors and successors, Mr. Norman Sandler, Rabbi Isaac Goss, Mr. Ronnie Mesheka, Dr. Baran, the principal, Mr. Tannenbaum, Mr. Lipschitz, whoever, Mr. Louis Sachs, whoever was involved in helping the sprouting of Jewish education, and then the successors, particularly Mrs. Raylene Tredonsky and her staff, and the people at the King David Schools Foundation, the South African Board of Jewish Education. May Hashem send bracha v'hatzlacha b'chol ma'aseh yedehem, blessing and success to all their deeds. Im kol Yisrael acheihem, with all their brothers Israel. V'nomar amen. And let us say amen. So I think that's a beautiful prayer. We say it every Shabbat in shul, in our synagogue prayers, every Shabbat. And I think it's the most appropriate prayer to pray with, to end with. And may we hear only good news. Looking forward to, in this closing chapter of not just South African Jewish history, it's world history, Jewish history in America, as we approach the days of the end of time, of the coming of the Mashiach, the final salvation, when we see the majority of the Jewish people moving to Israel and moving towards Judaism, which is also more important than just moving to Israel. That's the spiritual Israel. And then, of course, physically moving to Israel is so important, a role that King David's schools play such a big part in, and Mr. Wolf was so devoted to. And at these times, may we see even greater success as we go through the final struggles and motions towards the Acharit Hayamim and the coming Geula and the coming of Mashiach. May it happen merrily and happily and soon in our days.